We've been talking in this unit about ecology. And ecology is the study of living things and how they interact with their environment. So a really quick review from the first section. We talked about the levels of organization in ecology. How the biosphere is where you're studying every place on Earth where life exists. And then we can start to divide it into smaller pieces. We can study just a single organism, or we can study groups of the same type of organism. So bison, which is kind of like it's similar to a cow actually, or we can study a bison herd or a whole group of bison. We call that a population. Or if we study bison, we might need to know what they eat and what eats them. And that's when we start to study a community. So a bison, we'd have to be able to study the grass that the bison eat. And we'd have to study what their predators are. And so that's where we study a community. However, in order to truly understand how the grass can make food and the interactions between living and non-living things like the sun and carbon dioxide, that's when we study an ecosystem. So today we're going to focus on some of the non-living things. Abiotic factors like carbon dioxide, water, nitrogen. These are called your biogeochemical cycle. So bio means life. Geo means earth. And then chemical. And cycle means to reuse. So when we studied energy and how energy is transferred, remember the 10% rule? Energy is transferred. It's not used over and over and over again. But chemicals are cycled. So water is used over and over and over again. And so when you learn about the water cycle, which you've probably done many times, you learn that water enters through precipitation, and then it exits through evaporation or transpiration. And so you've already learned a little bit about the water cycle prior to coming to this class. And you have learned a little bit more about what exactly water is when you came to this class. So we want to add in a few things here. We want to remind ourselves that water is H2O. And so it's a molecule. It's one oxygen, two hydrogens. It's a molecule. And water is going to be recycled. And one of the reasons that we have to reuse is because there is only a set number of atoms. So there's only a set number of oxygen atoms on the whole Earth. New oxygen isn't coming from anywhere. We have to use and reuse the same water molecules that are found here on Earth. Now, water is produced as waste during respiration. And water is used during photosynthesis. So water is used during photosynthesis. So living things really rely a lot on water. And so when we look at the water cycle, water will come down to the ecosystem. This would have to be an ecosystem because we have living and non-living things. So water comes down to the ecosystem through what's called precipitation. And infiltration is where it gets into rivers and streams. But we also want to write on here the term runoff. As it rains and the water gets into the lakes and streams, we have what's called runoff. So it might not be absorbed into the ground, it might run down into the lake or stream. And runoff is actually sometimes really damaging because anything that's on the surface here will get caught in the water and might move into our lakes and streams. So this is why pollution can be a big factor with runoff. If we have any chemicals or trash or pollution, when the water runs down into the lakes or streams, that runoff can cause the pollution to get into the water. And so the big thing to know about the water cycle is this idea that it's used and reused, and that we have some specific processes that depend on water. Next is where we're going to focus most of our energy on learning, and it's the carbon cycle. And so we do want to talk just a little bit about what carbon is. Carbon itself is what we call an atom. Carbon is a single atom. But we can put carbon with other things to form a molecule. So in the carbon cycle, we mostly focus on CO2, which is a molecule. CO2 is a molecule. It's one atom of carbon, two atoms of oxygen, forms one molecule of CO2. And so when we look at CO2, it's mainly powered by cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Now, carbon dioxide is just like the other biogeochemicals. There's a certain amount of carbon on Earth. Now, carbon is found in carbon dioxide, but remember, carbon is also found in the body of the plant. There's carbon in the body of the plant. There's carbon in the body of the animal. Remember carbohydrates? When we look at our organic molecules, C, H, and O, proteins, carbs, lipids, nucleic acids, all have carbon or carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in these molecules. So there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's also carbon in every single living thing. Now, when living things perform cellular respiration, it's going to release CO2 or increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, the gases that are invisible to us, the atmosphere. So when we perform respiration, when we break down carbs to get energy for our body, we're releasing CO2. Remember that equation, C6H12O6 plus O2 produces CO2 plus H2O plus ATP. We're making CO2, and that CO2 gets released into the atmosphere. So when we talk about carbon, we start with a carbohydrate, we break it down and release carbon dioxide. Now photosynthesis, so cellular respiration releases CO2. Photosynthesis is actually going to use CO2 to build carbohydrates like C6H12O6. Remember, the plant has to build these to build its body. So photosynthesis is actually going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So respiration releases CO2, photosynthesis removes CO2. And that's why we say that the carbon cycle is powered by respiration and photosynthesis. Respiration releases it, photosynthesis takes it in. Respiration releases it, photosynthesis takes it in. Now notice plants perform some respiration as well. However, we do have two other big things that add carbon dioxide. And this one is burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have carbon in them. Fossil fuels are dead plants and animals that got pressurized by the earth, and that's fossil fuels like gas, wood, coal. When I burn those fossil fuels, we release CO2. So we add CO2 to the atmosphere. So normally respiration and photosynthesis perform this cycle, but when we burn lots of fossil fuels, we release too much carbon dioxide. So we're mainly focusing on the carbon cycle. We are going to talk just a little bit about the oxygen cycle. The oxygen cycle is also really affected by photosynthesis and respiration. If you remember, oxygen is present because, remember the P and the H? Remember when we talked about the heterotrope hypothesis and how photosynthesis releases oxygen? And so we have oxygen, and that is, instead of driven, let's say released. Oxygen is released by photosynthesis. And so this is how we have oxygen in the atmosphere. Respiration is going to consume, or what we call use, oxygen. And so again, we see it's this cycle. The oxygen cycle is really only affected by photosynthesis and respiration. There is a little bit of oxygen that gets dissolved into water, so dissolving like into rivers and streams. If you've ever been to the beach, you see the wave crash and there's all the foam. That foam is actually oxygen being pushed into the water. So the oxygen cycle is pretty straightforward. And then we have a new one called the nitrogen cycle. And this one is also this one's going to take a little studying, a little extra attention, because the nitrogen cycle is pretty new for some of us. When we think about nitrogen, we want to remind ourselves that nitrogen is used in proteins and in DNA and RNA. So if we don't have any nitrogen, we can't build proteins and we can't build DNA and RNA. So nitrogen is pretty important. The difficult thing is that nitrogen gas, we're going to write N2. There's lots of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. We can't see it with our eyes, and we don't use it when we breathe in and out, but it is in the atmosphere. However, no animals and no plants can use it all on their own. We need bacteria. So bacteria, prokaryotes, are actually able to convert nitrogen into usable forms. And so these bacteria are going to help take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and put it into a plant. And so as humans, we get nitrogen to build our proteins and DNA and RNA. We get that nitrogen from either eating a plant or from eating an animal that ate a plant. So we can't just get nitrogen from the air. It has to be converted or changed by a bacteria. Some important things about the nitrogen cycle is that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, fix means to secure. They're going to chemically convert nitrogen to more usable forms, and nitrogen is essential for living organisms so they can build proteins. There is one other thing that we want to add to this section. And that is that too much nitrogen. Nitrogen is found in fertilizers. And so if you're a farmer and you want your plants to grow more, you can put down fertilizer. And that usually has a lot of nitrogen in it, which is good for the plants growing. But if that fertilizer, if there is too much fertilizer, plants can overgrow, including in lakes and ponds. And so if you've ever seen a lot creating plant material, that is actually a bad thing for that ecosystem, because that means that the algae outcompetes or is stronger than a lot of the other living things and takes up too much space. So when we talk about biogeochemical cycles, this is the end of the notes. You need to know about the 4 cycles and why they are